WP forks, if you have KTMs, WP has 3 little rings in there. So the guys who set that up, and the manual tells them to do this, to set that on the lowest one, so you see a lot of fork pokes up. So where your forks are on the triple clamp, that's wheelbase. So think about a Suburban versus like a Suzuki Samurai, the twitchiness of it. Think of even like the old Jeeps versus like the newer Jeeps, the longer wheelbase. So when your forks come from the dealer and they set them up and they're very high, that promotes really aggressive feedback, turn in. The bike feels super lively, super responsive. KTM as a performance company, they want that rider feedback. They want people to feel and to say, oh, this bike, it turns in so good. I just think about turning and I'm there, I'm turning. So that's great if you're on a motocross track or if you're like riding aggressive single track and you're an aggressive single track rider. If that's who you are as a rider and that's the type of riding you're doing, then that's ideal. And you should leave it so that they're high. You should leave it on that 3rd ring. But that's not me. I want a bike that is stable at speed. I want a bike that has a bit of a slower turn in, so it's gonna be less twitchy, it'll be less aggressive, it's not gonna surprise me. I'm gonna be less inclined to get in a situation where I sort of get that shock, that scare of like, sometimes you'll ricochet off a rock and then you'll put a little too, so muscle, the gyroscope in your brain will have you react maybe a little too much. And then you add that to the fact that the bike is gonna turn in really aggressively. That can cause a front tire washout, you can go down. So what I do on all of our customer bikes and then all of my personal bikes is I want a long wheelbase. I want to slow the turn in down. I want the bike to feel at speed. So if I'm on a highway section, I don't want to be at 50, 60 miles an hour and feel any front end wobble. I don't want to have a truck pass me and feel a lot of washout. So to get that, the easiest thing to do is to drop your forks down in your tubes. These, I should probably drop those even one more. So on mine, you'll see that it's at the top of the fork tube where the fork cap meets each other. That's a mark, that's a spot. So that's not technically one of the machined marks, that's just the top cap. That's where I typically run mine. If I'm gonna go on a ride like a BDR or something that's longer duration and higher speed, then I will drop it down to see where the machine of the bolt is. So I can show you on this side too. So you see how there's a bit of a ridge where you'd put a tool over that to turn that top cap. That becomes another mark. And so if I'm gonna, like I said, do a BDR or something where I'm not turning, no single track, I'm not doing any of that. So then I drop it to there. So the fork, the top of the triple clamp becomes flush to that. So that would be the extreme at the stable. Like, I don't know that you could drop it, you could continue to drop it, but that's as far as I've ever dropped it. So that bike is gonna be so stable, I could be on the highway and not touch the, coasting down, I can let go of the bars and I can steer the bike with just counterweight, tracks really good. It becomes like a chopper, like a Harley. With the front wheel way out, the rake is really exaggerated. So that's what dropping the forks in the triple clamp will get you. The opposite is true as well. If you want your bike to be aggressive, you want really lively turn in, then raise them up. Maybe to the 2nd, 3rd level, the way your bike comes. If you go to a motocross track and you look at all the forks in the triple clamps, they're all gonna be super high because a motocross track, that promotes that sort of like aggressive turn in. And so you've got those marks that are in between. I'm looking at a lot of vet riders, a lot of riders with some experience. We don't want a twitchy bike, and so that's how you get that. So for no money, you can completely transform the feel of your bike. We've done this tons of times where people stop by and they're white knuckling it, they feel like their bike is fighting them, they're not having a relaxed experience. You should. So when I ride, I'm very conscious to keep my hands open. In fact, I will ride with a posture so that my hands are laying on the grips and I will dibble my fingers because when I do that and I feel in control, that's communicating to me that the bike is set up right, that the bike is working right, that I'm on it correctly, that I've got my center of balance where it needs to be, I'm on the pegs, I'm leaning forward a little bit, the balls of my feet are on my pegs, and I'm just biasing a little bit forward. So if you're riding and you feel like you're clenching too hard, you've got aches here in your forearms when you get off your bike, there's something either in your ride, in the psychology of you as a rider, that generally that means a lack of trust. You may not trust your experience, you may not trust where you are, there's some sort of confidence gap. It could also be that the bike is not set up for you. And so sometimes it's both of those things working together. And so that's like a terrible formula when that happens, but you can easily, you can reliably work on your bike, and then the rider psychology component, you could go see Cassie, what does she call it? Clear Moto. So there's lots of ways that you can change and improve your riding psychology, but there's easier, that maybe is a longer thing. There's really, like I said, there's really easy ways for you to change the way your fork height is, and that will change your bike. Another thing is you have these bleeder caps right here, these little, so I have quick bleeders, but every set of forks, no matter what bike it is, you have some screws on there. So what happens is temperature changes within your forks. Here's something you can do. Next time you're out on a ride and there's a lot of terrain change, okay, rocky, and you stop, feel the lower legs of your forks. They will be hot, they will be warm, they will be shockingly warm. There's a lot of friction that's happening, because imagine you have those two tubes that are sliding in and out of each other, and you have two sets of bushings, and all the energy that's happening at the front wheel, all those impacts, they're being transmitted into those bushings, those slide bushings, and the oil cools that, lubricates and cools. So that oil, it's critically important, and you'll be surprised how hot, warm, hot, maybe, those fork tubes are. So the front end is doing a tremendous amount of work. Air will build up, temperatures will change in there, air will gulp at those. So I've had this explained to me, I probably am not qualified to talk about why air builds up in there, so I should probably do a little research, do your own, but we all know that, air builds up inside of your forks, and then if you have these little bleeders, when I'm on a ride, all through the ride, I will bleed that air out. I will equalize that air pressure. So I'll put my side stand down, obviously, and I'll lean the bike over so the front wheel is unweighted, completely unweighted, hanging in space, and then I'll bleed that, and then go again. And I'll do that today I did it 4 times. We did that little single track thing, and so lots of square edges, lots of bashing, lots of rock hits, and so I felt my fork legs hot, and I bled my air, a lot came out. It hissed out for about 3 or 4 seconds. After bleeding, there is a noticeable difference between the before and after of the air bleed. Significant, like shocking. It's always surprising to me how much of an improvement. The forks become more plush, they eat up the rocks better. So those things don't cost anything, but they will completely change the feel of the front end of the bike and the confidence that you have in your bike. Any questions about any of that so far? Okay, yeah?
So as the pressure builds up and you bleed the pressure off, after they cool, does it pull it back?
Yeah.
Does that create a problem?
Yeah, so that's why you're constantly doing that. So you're done with the ride, everything cools down, now it's gonna be in a vacuum state, so that next morning before you take off, you bleed it, and your ear won't hear the difference between air in and air out, you'll just hear a hiss, but it's pulling air back in. So you're just continually equalizing ambient pressure. As I'm from Vegas, 2,600 feet, this is 9,000. The first thing I did when I pulled this out is I hit the deal. I had done that before, as a little experiment, I kind of wanted to see. So at home, you have a bag of chips, you live at sea level and you come up here and the bag's all pressed out, right? Yes, so right off the truck, I hit that and I didn't ride it. So it was that's just ambient change, altitude change.
May I add one thing?
Yeah.
Going with what you're saying, when you're tighten your bike on the truck, you strap it down, you're creating that positive pressure. This isn't air suspension, this is spring suspension. So it's also good to, so that on your ride, that chamber isn't pressurized.
That's a really good point. Another thing you can do, just thinking about the suspension in the front end, when I travel with my bike and I strap it down, you could use a piece of wood, you could cut a piece of 2x4 to stick in there, you can buy a fancy little, fork gapper thing, but you absolutely want to put something so you are not, a spring in tension will degrade its life cycle. A spring only has so many compressive cycles, okay? And so if you crank that thing down and you've got 2 days on the trailer, that has an effect cumulatively. Not that one time, but cumulatively. So just a piece of 2x4 or one of those little fancy things, super important. Another thing that's really important on the front end, on any bike of any brand, of any size, is to have your fork tubes in parallel. And so that's something that's super important. And a really easy way to do that, because a lot of you are probably gonna go drop your forks down. Good idea. After you do that, did you get them, this is super exaggerated, but are they in is the axle in parallel with each other, or is it off? How do you tell? So an easy pass or fail is take your axle, clean it, clean the inside of your races, clean your axle really well, and it should slide in, slide out. Just no friction, no tension. If there's any binding or tension, and then grab it and turn it, and it should just almost spin in there. That means you are exactly in parallel. Any friction means you're not. Adjust accordingly until you get that smooth in out action with the front axle. Does that make sense? All bikes, all sizes. That's super important. So we talked about fork oil. Shockingly, a lot of us probably have the fork oil from the factory, and our bikes are 3 years old or 4 years old or 5 years old, and we haven't even thought about it. You will be shocked at how just changing the oil in your forks will make a difference. Also, the shock oil should be done typically 2 times as often as fork oil, and that's because heat. So a couple of things. The fork, the load of the front end is being transferred through 2 fluid vessels, 2 forks. You only have 1 shock. And so there is all of that work happening in that oil. Now, granted, there's much more travel in the front end than there is in the shock, but there's only 1 shock. The other thing that happens on these smaller bikes is the exhaust is in inches away from that shock. That heat's going into that shock. So the friction from the action of the shock creates heat, the heat of the exhaust. So on our bikes, and you can look at this later, you don't have to look at it now, but we wrap our exhaust with like ATV style, what am I trying to say? Heat shield, yeah, heat shield. So we don't do that. Some guys will wrap their whole entire exhaust. There's pros and cons to that. We don't do that, but we do use that ATV style heat shield. A strip of it, it's about 10 inches. And again, you can look at it later, but we put that where the exhaust goes right by the shock. And that on practical testing, about 150 degrees of heat that we don't have going to that shock. So that's significant. Questions about suspension, those easy to make changes, you're all tracking? Okay, now let's talk about valving. So you've got all those free things. One other thing before we move on. So clickers. If you bought a used bike, the clickers are screwed up. Just count on it. Also, count on the oil, the fork oil never having been changed, right? So just when you buy, that kind of goes with everything on a used bike. No matter what they say, unless they give you dealer receipts, unless they give you some actual evidence that stuff is done, it's just, hey bro, I kept up on my maintenance and everything's copacetic. Don't believe any of that. So start from scratch, set like your maintenance timer from 0 on everything. All the fluids, suspension oils, the bushings, the sliders, the seals, all that stuff. Just have that set at 0. And also consider that those clickers are wrong, they're not right. And it's important that they be right. That is a critical, let me say this, Malcolm Smith, he used to say, I read this in an article once, he said if you have $100 to spend on your dirt bike, spend $99 on the suspension. all bikes go fast enough to kill you. All bikes have plenty of power. All bikes will make you crap your pants. So do you need more exhaust and more ECU and more like I do, but you may not. So the most important thing you should do to your bike is that contact with the ground keeps you from dying. And so the tires, so the suspension system is the tire, what's inside the tire, your connection to that assembly, and then your hands, whatever you grab on. All of that is the suspension. So I take the phrase suspension or the word suspension and I include all of that. So yes, this is suspension, but so is that, and so are the grips. That's all suspension. So the clickers, any of the suspensions, hydraulic dampers. So you're just moving fluid from one chamber to another, and you're controlling the rate and the speed and the rebound rate of all of that fluid exchange. The clickers set the compression. So compression is this, and then rebound is this. So think about that Cadillac. Everybody's seen a Cadillac going down the road, you know, because the shocks are blown. So it compresses, and then there's no rebound. Rebound is, it's free rebound. Rebound is more dangerous than, so having bad rebound is more dangerous than having bad compression. Because rebound is what happens when the tire needs to get back to the ground. You want the tire, you always want the tire on the ground. If it's in the air, you're dying. And I don't mean jumping. I mean, if you hit something and the tire goes up and that's a little jump off a rock, nothing you do here is gonna change your direction, or it doesn't matter because there's no contact. So the rebound is, they're both important, but I spend more time tuning my clickers and paying attention to rebound than I do compression. Compression is when your bike feels harsh, like you hit something and it just knocks your filling loose. That's compression. But rebound is the tire coming back to the ground. If it comes back too fast, it's a basketball, it can bounce. If it's too slow, then it stays too high and you hit the new rock, and then the suspension compresses a little more, and then you hit another rock and it compresses a little more. So there's this, it's a voodoo art. Suspension is like a voodoo art. It's really cool. But you're trying to figure out what is the right amount of speed for you, as my settings are not gonna you're not gonna like my settings. And I wouldn't like yours, because I sit on my bike different. I ride at a different pace. I might hit rocks that you steer around. So it's such a uniquely personalized thing that if you have a bike that is set up for you and you feel completely safe, I probably would hate that, because I'm a completely different rider with a different set of skills. So it's really important, and you can watch lots of YouTube videos, there's articles and essays. Having your clickers set correctly for you and your ride style and your setup is probably if you do nothing else, learn about your clickers, set them to spec. If you don't know that they're not to spec, set them to spec. Like, look up your manual online, set them to factory spec, and then start playing around with them. Do it. Do the rebound first. Play with the rebound and do 2 clicks in any direction. So plus, you have a plus or a minus. Plus means you're gonna get more of that, minus means you're gonna get less of that. And how that fluid works is there's an orifice and there's a plug. I usually do this, but since we're in mixed company, I'm gonna avoid that. So a plug, you have an orifice and then a plug, and that plug is you're trying to find the rate of leak. It's a controlled leak. And so you're trying to find where the controlled leak is giving you the best feel and feedback. Does that make sense? Okay, so learn about your clickers, drop your forks, they're probably too high, you probably haven't changed your clickers, you probably aren't bleeding your air, all of free. No, we haven't spent any money, and all of that will completely change your experience. Now, if you want to spend money, then you'll go next level. So when you spend money, what happens is a suspension tuner who is a magician. I know a lot of suspension tuners. I have one that we work with our Moto suspension, and it's a black art, because inside of there, the fluid control, you have a piston that leaks fluid, and then you have these shims that sit on top of that. I'll draw it later if you're interested, or watch videos. There's people that do a better job explaining this than I do. But you're changing the rate that the fluid pushes on those shims and leaks past. So what he will do is he will look at what you have, you'll describe, I don't like this, it does that, and in his little voodoo brain, he'll be like, okay, I think I'm gonna add 2 of this and take away 1 of that. It's almost like a master chef who you just say, I want a steak, and he's like, what kind of, he asks you a couple questions, and he goes back and he's like, I know what to cook you. I don't get it, it's magical, and it costs money, and it is magical. Once you have ridden a bike that has professionally tuned suspension and your clickers are set and all this is right, it is absolutely the best experience. I can't even describe it. It is worth the time, the effort, and the money to get your suspension right. That's my soapbox. I'm preaching hard. Nothing will change your riding experience more than suspension. Tires, absolutely important. You may be on the wrong tires for the condition. Cheap tires are typically hard tires, not always. Hard tires are probably ruining your experience. A lot of us ride hard tires because they're cheap, and the guy at the motorcycle shop, the flat brimmer kid, his manager told him, like, we got too many of that. Everybody who comes in and wants a tire gets that. So a lot of us are on too hard of tires. Hard tires don't flex, they don't yield, they don't have fingers that want to grab the rocks, they don't reach and claw. And so then the counter argument is, yeah, but soft tires wear out too fast. I know. That's the trade-off of life. I like a tire that's these little rubber fingers grabbing on rocks. And so I pay the price literally with money because I run a softer compound tire. It gives me more confidence. You know when I said, like, I can do my hands like this? Because I very carefully selected tires. Inside of my tires are mousse. That is a thing. We won't talk about that now. But like the setup of your bike, if really thoughtfully done for the conditions you're in, and if it's all right, you can just relax your hands. It's the most magical thing.
What about like slime and stuff like that in tires? Is that terrible?
No, not at all. So tubes, maybe we'll talk about this really quick. I didn't plan on going down this road, but so if you run tubes, there is a case to be made. All tire systems have strong advantages and strong disadvantages. There is no one best. For me, mousse are best for me, but they may not be best for you. A tube may be best for someone, and just it's so conditional to who you are and what you're doing. And unfortunately, when you go to a bike shop, a lot of times they're not educating. They're just selling you, you come in with a concern. I have a problem with X or Y, and they're not trained, or they're not gonna educate, they're not gonna listen. So if you want, you can send me emails or you can talk to me, and I'm happy to listen to, this is like a good doctor spends the time, listens to who you are, and then says, okay, we're gonna do something different for you than we did for you, because you're not the same person at all. So tubes are cheap, they're easy, you can patch them, they've been around, Mr. Dunlop invented them, they've been around a long time. You can carry spares. There's a lot of advantages to tubes. The main disadvantage to tube is pinch flats. So a rock, so it's a sandwich. You have your Mr. Rock, tube, rim. When they come together aggressively, the weakest link is the tube. And so here's a little tip on our tubes. We grease the tubes with silicone mousse lube, because if that tube squirts out, if you get lucky and it's slimy and it squirts out, you can avoid a pinch flat. And so we lube our tubes. Baby powder, don't do that. Mousse lube. or silicone oil or silicone grease. You can even use petroleum. Petroleum will degrade the rubber. It will soften the rubber. So some people do that. We don't do it. Silicone. I've run tubes on bikes and have customers that run tubes for years and years and years and years. Their tubes are years old because they slime them. They don't marble, they don't rub, you know what I mean? Have you ever pulled a tube out and it marbles? They don't do any of that. And as long as they don't flat it, tubes can last for years. Especially when you buy like a Bridgestone ultra heavy duty tube, that's the king of tubes. So let's not go down the tube inflation rabbit hole. There's too much to talk about. Forks, everybody's good on the forks and what you do with your ride height or the fork height. Okay. We're not going to discuss it, but some people are shorter and they want more ground clearance. That's a whole separate thing. So this is just generically talking about average height people who, okay, we got that covered. Idle speed. I get bikes at our shop from dealers from the crate. These are bikes that have, like, we're starting them for the first time as a non-factory entity. The idles are always too low. I don't know why they do that. It is critical that your idle speed be set correctly and that you have an instrument or some way. Ear is not good enough. You have some instrument, and I'm specifically talking about single-cylinder dirt bikes, not like a Tenere or the bigger bikes that have an idle air controller and a solenoid, and that's all electronic. The bike sets its idle itself. I'm talking about where you have a knob, a screw, even a carburetor bike. So why that's so critical is because a lot of us who ride single-cylinder bikes complain about coffin stall. So coffin stall, that's that pop and stall. That's where you're like, you are coming off of idle, you're riding in rocky technical terrain, you're trying to come off of idle, you've been decelerating or you've had no idle input, and you're gonna now add a little throttle and it bucks and coughs and stalls. Okay, there are numerous reasons why that happens. The number one free way to attempt to try to eliminate that for you is your idle is too low. Your bike manual will tell you what the idle speed is. Any KTM product, this is a 500, so 450, 500, 501s, that class of bike, the idle speed, factory idle speed is 1800 to 1900. I run mine at 1900. The faster your idle, the less your engine is lugging and choking and trying to, the lower your idle speed, it doesn't want to run. And so you bump it up to that at the upper end of that range. It will, yes?
How do you, on a fuel injected bike, how do you set your idle?
Okay, I won't go into that here, but your manual will tell you what the idle speed should be, and it will show you where the knobs are to do that.
Okay, all right. But that's all enough.
Yes, but I can tell you later. You need to have some way to know what your idle is. So you can do that through really cheap. There's a phone app. Robert can show you on his phone later. There's this great little app. I think it's like $4, and it listens to the power. So every time your cylinder fire, every time your exhaust valve opens, there's a sound wave. So this is it's a little listening app. It's very clever, and it listens for each power pulse. And then the algorithm determines and then it displays an idle speed. Amazing, genius. So for $4, you've got a tack in your pocket. And when you change altitude, so my idle speed at home was money on. When I got here, too low. Because the air density is different here than it is at home. This is lower oxygen level. And so it messed with my idle. So I took out the thing, I did the adjust, we're good to go. So do not be afraid. Don't ride your bike year after year after year. Well, the factory said it. It's like, that's not a thing. Like you should be managing the system and all the systems. You should be aware of what they are. A better way than the app is to have a tack. And there's a lot of, this is a tack. You could buy these little cheap Trailtech TTOs, Tusk, Rocky Mountain, $14. So having a tack somewhere, I see a lot of people put them on the side of their frame. That's great. You could have it in your bars, whatever. But knowing what your idle speed is, absolutely, that can be game changing. You could have a bike that's coughing and stalling and hard to ride, bucking you, and you just put your idle to spec, magic, free. Now, if you want to improve it even more, we won't talk about it now, but you could do things like exhausts, mufflers, airflow, intake reads on KTMs, tuning, all of that. We're not going to go down any of those rabbit holes, but there's always the free way that the manual is like the most amazing thing. There's so much good information in there. We should all be, looking at our manuals and know what it says. So your idle speed's probably too low. Your forks are probably too high. Any questions about any of that so far?